particular presentation today comes out of the African Literary Cities project, which I run with my co-investigator, Lauren Nkula-Wentz, from the African Center for Cities. It has been funded by the National Research Foundation of South Africa since 2023. So we're now in 2025, coming towards the end of this first funding cycle. And we'll talk you through what the project has achieved, a little bit about what the basic principles of the project are, and of course we're thinking about how to take it forward, in future. But we start with this idea of a curious absenting of the African literary city. And we start with the cities of literature, which we call a cartography of absence. Perusing the list of the United Nations UNESCO creative cities, one that has been consistently growing since its inception in 2004, a glaring absence becomes visible in the field of literature. Generally in the global south. There's a huge concentration around Europe. But we recognize that out of those countries, only 2 African cities, Durban and Buffalo City in South Africa, have managed to be included in this list of 53 cities of literature globally. So there are 2 things to this. One thing is that this is something you apply for, cities have to mobilize for. So it's self-selection, these designations, you need to mobilize your own resources in order to apply for it, which might explain, the global north focus of it. On the other hand, this dearth of African literary cities remains unsettling, because it's producing something, a cartography that is at odds with what we see on the ground. So, the slide above, I'm not going to read it, but it's quoting from the Cities of Literature site itself, the UNESCO site. And it gives you a sense of this notion of literary infrastructure, right? What they're looking for. UNESCO selection criteria are skewed towards hard infrastructure, i.e., local publishing industry, the existence of libraries, bookstores, public or private cultural centers. So this sort of literary infrastructure is important as a sort of normative evaluation criteria, right? But it tends to develop or reproduce a sort of developmentalist, neo-imperialist notion of what the literary city is, right? And it sort of traps the African literary city then at this moment of unfinished development. And it does not account for the dynamic and diverse experiences of both African literariness and African urbanities. So I suppose one of the reasons that I picked some of this wording was to show that over and behind the hard infrastructure, you also have all this other labor to do, right? You need a certain sort of support from your national commission, the time to set up these meetings, stakeholder meetings, etc. All that know-how sort of ends up, instead of it being self-selection, there's also sort of exclusion that then happens as a result of the processes themselves. And another way in which we come to think about this sort of what we call disciplinary anxiety around the absenting of the African city is this emerging disciplinary thinking about literary urban studies. So within the scholarly realm, the publication of Charting Literary Urban Studies, Texts as Models of and for the City, 2021, Literary Urban Studies and How to Practice It, also 2021, Finch, and a relatively new but prolific literary urban studies book series by Palgrave Macmillan underscores the recent emergence of literary urban studies, LUS, located at the intersection of urban and literary studies. So urban literary studies brings then urbanity into conversation with literariness. And then literary fiction, right, is used as a form, as a way of thinking through urban materiality. And it sort of starts to do the thing where literary narratives are also used to think of as social investigations around the materiality of the city. And so where we are, what it does, it also produces this productive conversation then between imaginaries and the material complexities of African cities and urbanities. However, despite a range of transdisciplinary methodologies which engage, then again, urbanity, cityness, literariness, and pathways such as literary anthropologies, literary geographies, phenomenologies of urban condition, these literary urban studies textbooks and series tend to reproduce the same overproduction, overrepresentation of the global north, right? So it again reproduces that mapping that we saw earlier. So what we propose then is rethinking literary urban studies from the perspective of Southern urbanism. I love this particular quote. You'll see I did not quote Abdul Simone nearly enough. And Edgar Peterson, who some of you might know from the African Central Cities. But this particular book, The Paradoxes of the Urban, captures a lot of, I think, how this notion of the story can be both around urbanism, around this materiality, and around imaginary. But the African everyday is related to entangled transactions and the affective matrices which we think of as nodes of storytelling. And the quote there is about thinking about the city as storylines. And if we think about that, what sort of different connections can we produce? Who are the knowers of the city? So the epistemological violence that I've thought of then in my first slides, that sees African cities through a sort of Western-centric notion of modernity, certain notions of order, and the resultant sort of developmentalist optics of abjection, precariousness, and failure are precisely what is contested by the discipline of Southern urbanism. So we draw on Southern urbanisms in this project, position ourselves squarely between African literary and Southern urban studies, thinking about Southern urbanisms as both a geographic reality, material reality, but also an epistemological endeavor, right? Sort of countering presence versus absence. So we draw deeply about knowledge through knowledge production in and from the global South, thinking about it in terms of its own value in its own right versus as a response to dominant knowledge systems. And so this is where then this is how we seek to address what I've then termed a disciplinary anxiety, right, around the absencing of the city. I hope I don't have to read the quotes, because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. So I might go back because you'll start reading this before I get to it. But I want to then think about then the sort of research questions that this produces, right? Urban studies, the reduction of the post-colonial image to a slum, and to the overdetermined significance of precarious citizenship is then challenged, right? Allowing us to challenge the silence of Afro-pessimism as a conceptual lens. And this allows us to then think about this distinction between global and world class versus post-colonial, all right? And it is into this space that we then propose our research question, which is, does the African literary city conceived as a form that traces modernist and imperialist, that's the literary city rather, conceived as a form that traces modernist and imperialist pathways, deny literary creative economies that exist in the global south. Does this literary city then also then particularly deny the presence of the African literary city or the African continent within this cartography? And this is where we came to our three axes of reflection: literary ecologies, literary urban ecologies, hubs, and maps. Because it's through the works of scholars such as Abdul Simone and Atu Kwesi, Edgar Peterson, even drawing on the works of those who do not necessarily call themselves part of literary urban studies, which is a term that's coming up now, but people like Ashid Mbembe and Sarah Nuttall, the work on Johannesburg, for example, can be thought of through this lens of Southern urbanism, allowing us to understand the urban to be a very messy intersection of colonial and racially segregated histories, post-colonial, post-independence ambitions of modern statehood, uneven infrastructure development, interlinked hinterlands, complex mobilities that make the city, so that our understanding then of the urban or of the city itself, it becomes a far more human affair, all right? So if we think then of the episteme of the everyday, these are some of the areas that we have thought through. Disciplines in outlining the scope of our research, disciplines such as book history, material infrastructures of literariness, the ways in which the African literature, in many ways, the ways in which it started to travel was through series such as the African Writers Series, so the ways in which Oxford Publishing sort of curated a particular view of what African literary identity was, right, in the post-colonial era. The circulation of images and representations of African cities, thinking through cities as traveling form. I think there's a way in which mobility becomes important here, because we cannot think of this, the one thing we realize thinking through urbanities is the ways in which they connect across the continent, and the ways in which there's parallels, there's echoes, there's ways in which we imagine each other across the continent as well, right? And there's also the authors themselves and the ways in which they travel, right? We also think about literary cultural analysis, narrative, sonic, and representational approaches. And part of this reason was because we wanted to get away from thinking about the notion of rethinking the very idea of what it means to have a reading culture. Because so much reading culture also comes from the street, comes from street poetry, comes through small magazines. And there's a way in which also, again, if you are connected to this notion of infrastructure and big publishing houses, the very reading of what constitutes the literary then becomes actually very exclusive. So the city is told, the specificity of the African city not being told by stability and order, but rather being told by the diverse acts of ordinary people, elaborated through flexibly configured landscapes of the city as a site for survival, for desire, for life in particular ways, life and death. I mean, not necessarily desire for death, but for living, for space for living. We relate this to the dynamic materialism of urbanity, lived and imagined, rather than defined by static infrastructures. And I'm going to mispronounce their names, but Forster and Stakeholder signal the importance of how ordinary cities and ordinary citizens in ordinary cities imagine the African urban. proposing urban creative forms as sites for exploring the seemingly chaotic city spaces, and taking seriously then the lived experience, the everyday experience in these cities. We're building on this very notion then of the ordinariness, right? That is enacted, narrated, represented inside and outside of the text. And I think in some ways I was a little bit uncomfortable with this because so much of this is around material culture, right? Materiality. Even think about circulation of books as material culture, etc. But there's a really important element of this study, which is also thinking about the imaginary, right? And putting those two together into conversation, which is where I come in as a literary scholar and my colleague comes in as an urban geographer, in a sense. So then we move to this notion of people as infrastructure, right? That builds on into our conception of urban ecologies, right? People as infrastructure, then, this a way of enacting and imagining this seemingly chaotic space, right, opens the urban up to new and unexpected forms of relation. The construction by individuals who desire to master the limitations imposed by questions of infrastructure, right? I think we've had some of those discussions earlier, things around state support, things around resources, etc. So they invent, there's this space then, instead of thinking of it as through the optic of lack, we think of the abundance that is produced by those strategies, right? The ways in which urban residents invent ranges of new practices, religious, sexual, institutional, the ways in which they then relocate themselves as actors, and produce different frames, right? Different forms of community, and different ways of identifying who are the stakeholders for themselves, right? Who is important, who are their collaborators in those spaces. And so this notion of urban ecologies then is also related to this, what I've sort of signaled before, that there's a notion of a high literary culture, right? Which in many ways would be easier understood by these projects like the UNESCO Cities of Literature, right? Dominant, high literary niche aligned roughly to the cultivation and sale of paper-bound books, right? Thinking about book festivals, book fairs, literary festivals, publishing houses, libraries, etc., right? And then, of course, the tension, which I'm not completely convinced that we have managed to address. So I'm signaling that now, that perhaps our project also still needs to do a little bit more work in that regard, because it is easier as an academic to get into the paper-bound space, right? Emergent literary forms, right? For people on the move looking for relatively short, immersive experiences of reading. And that's wording I take from Sarah Bruett's The Underdevelopment of African Literature, Emerging Forms of Reading, 2020 publication. So, and this is how she frames this, the thinking around the knowledge economy of the culture city, right? And how it is tied to urban planning of literary infrastructure, such as writers' festivals, etc., but also then leaves this other, I don't want to call them subterranean, but street level sort of everyday forms of the literary unexplored, right? And so then hopefully maybe there's a way I touch on entanglements in a slightly different way to you, Aisa. But with this notion of literary urban entanglements, then, I mean, ecologies make sense of these complex entanglements, right? And the reproduction of city and literature, right? And what we're hoping to do is sort of subvert the present dialectic of center, periphery, north, south, formal, informal, etc. Absence, I mean, lack, developing, etc. You know, developing, by adopting this sort of transdisciplinary approach, which, as I'm stating, is not without its tensions, and it's not without perhaps oversight on our part. But it is very much an inside, outside the text, material in imagine, urban and literary, but very firmly anchored in the African context. The reason I'm really stressing that is that we have tried very hard to try and partner up with other projects in the Global South. There's Poetry Africa, who are both based in KwaZulu-Natal, at University of KZN. They also do a mapping of poets, all the poets who come to their festival over the years. They also have a living map. There is the small publishers, the African Small Publishers Catalog, which has been published, I think, for the last, I think around 3 to 4 years. We've also been in contact with them because the idea is that we're building a living map, and eventually we'll have these layers, because they then map and plot these smaller publishing houses that are not really captured elsewhere. So that's a project that's happening as well. So there's a way in which we're really trying to surface what people are already doing now and sort of bring it together. All right, I've been on one slide for a very long time, and I've got a lot to get through. So literary sites, and African creative economies. So when we're thinking of hubs, we're thinking of African cities as hubs that participate in the production, circulation, and consumption of literature. And also then thinking not just about, again, capitalism or the sale of books, etc., or in sort of industrial scale production of literary culture, but also then thinking about how to unpack sort of broader affective, aesthetic dimensions then of the literary within these hubs. I was at APES recently, and we had a double panel, and one of the panelists actually had an amazing presentation on Egyptian literary, literary culture. And think about Cairo and the ways in which self-publishing, ordinary people self-publish and claim and write it on Facebook their identity as a producer of literature, right? So there's a literariness that is seen as incredibly ordinary, right? And has an affect, and the affect is saying, I write, I produce. They'll buy their own, they'll organize their own book launches and little cafes. And it's outside of this sort of formalized publishing house sort of scenario, right? And it's so, yes. And I think what we're trying to do then is to say, then the knowers of the city and the knowers of the literary cities are not always the people we think they are, right? The knowers of who writes and who tells stories about the city are also those who write things like flash fiction, right? Apparently in Nigeria there was a whole thing about, during the COVID pandemic, apparently young doctors used to write flash fiction and share that, right? Stories that circulate on short forms like WhatsApp, all of that, burgeoning a huge, growing online book review culture, right? I was at IK last year in Lagos, and there was there was a whole panel at that literary festival dedicated to young people who review books and through whom then the material books circulate, but they are the ones who start the conversation about them, right? So there's a way in which then the hubs are also about politics of self-affirming, I'd say, collective narrative of cityness and about particular cities. What we've noticed, for example, like the Nairobi Book Festival was on recently. That there are certain book festivals and certain literary events that very much around the city's identity, or at least anchored in what that city sort of imagined itself to be. So shared imaginary or co-imaginary, right, of literary identities, certain cities. Just giving you the Cairo example. Trying to depart from this, getting a little bit more fine-grained than the national imaginaries that we know exist, right? So we're not trying to get into that national state level, which of course one could, but I suppose it would be a different project. Yes. And also thinking about canons that are formed around cityness. A very interesting example, which is curated from elsewhere, but I've found very interesting, is the Akanshik Noir series, which is crime novels that are set in particular cities. I think they've gone, I don't know how many cities they have in their list now. But it's been interesting to see which cities they have selected in the African continent to be part of this, right? And the particular genres that are associated with cities, like crime fiction, I'm trying to think now of specific, like certain sorts of popular fiction that are also very much embedded in ways of telling urban stories. But there are canons then that produce certain hubs in and of themselves. Tell me if I'm running late. Am I okay? All right. And then a third arm of this project is mapping. We were speaking back to a map in some ways. So mapping is important. Turning absence into presence, or cartographies of presence. But more importantly, building a public archive. So the project ultimately aims to produce a densely textured mapping that belies these sort of naturalized exclusions that I started off with. But I think it's worth noting here that we're not trying to create an authoritative definition of what the African literary city looks like. Rather, we're interested in mapping, right, what already exists, how urbanities and locally produced imaginaries sort of intersect, right, and how certain cities, I particularly think of Lagos, like Johannesburg, Nairobi, that these co-imagined sort of narratives around the cities are sort of cast out into the world, right, also. Like the literary festivals that happen in these spaces are also a way of casting out those identities of those cities, literary identities of those cities, creative identities of those cities out into the world, right? And of course, and thinking about that, again, attention that is produced about being cast out into the world, is a question of the diaspora. Because in literature, you'll have a diasporic writer like Chris Avani having written Graceland set in Lagos, right? So the idea that I always like to say from my other work, I always think of geography. I hope there are no geographers in here because I'm a fake geographer. Geography, not with a capital G, as the discipline, but geographies with a small g, and a far more, thinking about it like far more flexible ways that is of imagining the world without the sort of the transparency of the map, because the map in itself is falsely transparent, right? Gives us a certain notion of neatly bound territoriality and belonging and things like that. So some of the ways in which we think of this mapping are definitely, beyond what is geography. It's a cartography that is small g, not big, right? So then we start to think about the ecology of Pan-African networks, literary networks, intracontinental connections. The notion of so much of what has happened in literary spaces has been the sort of capital cities, right? And not thinking about secondary cities. There are certain countries where actually, for example, Zimbabwe, you've got Harare, but Bulawayo is a really strong literary city. There's a lot of literary production that comes out of there, right? So then to get beyond then this focus on just capital cities in the African context, and then again this idea of what it means for these cities to be worldly, or these literatures, or these sort of creative literary hubs, these literary ecologies to produce a sense of worldliness, right? Right. So, UNESCO caught up with us because in 2025, about 2 months ago, this book came out, The African Book Industry. And I'm quoting this directly from them. And they write about how literary festivals and book fairs increasingly enhance the international visibility of African literatures. They have a lot more resources than we did. We just traveled to a couple of literary festivals. They managed to find 200, professional associations that they identified at national level. This is an excellent book. It's available for free on the UNESCO site. And what it tells us, is that the intuition about wanting to excavate this was actually, there was something there, right? And there's still a lot to be done. So that is literary festivals. And why literary festivals? I think what we examine is the curatorial practice of literary festivals. Because there's something about the choices that curating those events, those spaces, does in these urban contexts that is very much about it. I think about this idea of spaces of literary encounter, right? Where yes, there's a meeting with the materiality of the books, the business aspect of it, right? But for example, the Ake Festival, it's Nigerian food, you get the fashion, there's a marketplace, there's panels with young, like I said, people who are influencers, TikTokers, who are talking book talk, African book talk. So there's this way in which the sort of literary anthropology, right, interviews with stakeholders, writers, readers, audiences, publishers, etc., within those spaces, together with participant observation, visual discourse analysis of how these, the material, that is produced by these literary festivals, the program, etc., enables then us to study how the city of literature is harnessed and produced. And then you can see some of these posters are from events that we've had, public seminars that we've had over the last couple of years. And we did have one, Think in the City through small print. But creative economies are also linked to literary collectives and online magazines, right? So we adopt this decolonial, what we're saying, trying to do the everyday, reach beyond the confines of the academy as much as we can, despite our training, to try and find the more colloquial spaces, right? And we know that literary collectives such as in Kenya, Kwai, literary collective founded in 2003, which included authors such as Binya Venga Wainina, etc. Those people go on to produce novels later on, right? FemRight, founded in 1995 by the Ugandan Women's Writers Association in Kampala, has been the object for a number of studies because it's also produced writers such as Jennifer Makumbi, who have gone on to win major international awards, right? So these are some of the people that we're in conversation with. Not necessarily, I don't have somebody from Kwai yet, but Femright definitely, we're in conversation with them to think about how these communities, these spaces are, again, outside of state infrastructure, right? Being produced, being created, going on to then feed into like the mainstream sort of literary production of particular spaces. But they harness the talent at that point. And they themselves then become hubs that participate in the production, circulation, etc. Right? Then our next slide is, so part of the project's presence has been student activation and scientific outreach. Because we're based in Cape Town, we actually work with the Open Book Festival, which happens there every year. And every year they would be curated or yes, at least 2 panels where writers whose work sort of really spoke to the city, like set on Cape Town city stories, or reading the streets, sort of those sort of themes to bring it to the broader public. And what was amazing, I mean, Cape Town City Stories was one of our first ones, and it was packed. It had 100 people in that room. We paid 50 Rand a ticket to participate in a discussion around their city. I mean, it probably made sense because it was their city. And not only that, one of the writers on the panel writes in Afrikaans. Cape Town Afrikaans, a very particular Cape Town Afrikaans, who is also somebody who'd written a newspaper column. And so there were a lot of people who came to see him and to see how, to see him in this sort of formalized literary space, right? And engage with their own stories about Cape Town. So this is one of our collaborators, the Open Book Festival. And at the Open Book Festival as well, we had, so one of the things that we do is that we have created a Literary Cities postgraduate elective, which is master's students. We're also, part of our funding allowed us to have master's dissertations, to supervise some master's dissertations, to try and develop a cohort of students who think around literary urban studies from the perspective of Southern urbanisms. So in the first year, we actually did a student activation with students where we had a blank map of the African continent at the Open Book Festival, and participants, general public were asked to just map where they thought these things were, publishing houses, literary festivals, literary magazines. It was interesting, the blanks that came up on the map, and to also give us a sense of what is out there circulating as knowledge around creativity and this literary creativity and the literariness of the African continent. I mean, of course, we were in South Africa, so almost everything was in South Africa. Then there was Nigeria, then there was a bit of Kenya, and then Francophone Africa and Lusophone Africa fell because people weren't so familiar, right? Yes, again, and this year we're going to go back, but now we've got a website, so it'll be a lot more high tech. And we'll be asking participants, the public, our students, not us, but we'll be asking the public to sort of do this mapping, but on a laptop, right? So we can capture the information more easily, because this is impossible to capture. It's been terrible. I'm nearly there, so this is like the second last slide. So actually, right at the beginning of on my very first slide, there's a link to our website, African Literary Cities at uct.ac.za. This is a website we've been developing with some web designers who are Nairobi-based, thinking about mobilities, right? And what it does is, this then is something, again, these South-South collaborations. These are colleagues in India who have a project called Cities in Fiction, where they have been with their students, they started years ago, just every time they taught a class, got their students to start to map cities, literary imaginaries or literary representations of cities in particular books, short stories, etc. And they've, over the years, developed this really nice way that the public, right, can just contribute to this public archive. What it does mean, though, obviously, is that you can't just, because websites are websites and people are, not very respectful, there is a moderation process, right? So people do enter their contribution, and then there's still a monitoring process where we check the veracity before it actually appears on the map. This website, the link that you have, I mean, it's live, but it's still being refined. I think date of publication still comes up as place of date of birth at the moment, but you're free to look at it and even share it and even contribute to it. And this is the map where we're saying at present it's mapping books, literary imaginaries, right? But the publishers, the small publishers, catalog people have just given us permission to map the entire catalog. So then it would have, you could map on the continent all the small publishers. And what we're hoping to do is eventually then have a third layer of literary festival, because if you can layer the map, then the map becomes really an archive, public archive that's for students, researchers, really, and it's collaborative as well. And I think that is my story. I just want to say thank you. These are some images from some of our events, some of the discussions where we've had, this being our last year of funding. I think we've got Phoebe from Cassava Republic coming through to talk to us and also see our students. We've got James Morowa from Nairobi coming through for our last panel at Open Book, where people will be then really speaking to their own work and their own, look at this space. Thank you, everybody. Oh, and I provided this link. We've got a Spotify account because our students also produce podcasts as part of their assignments, where they think about, they pick particular cities and they produce podcasts where they reflect on them using the theoretical language that they have developed in class. Right.